it's a true passion of mine to really have the platform and have a business school that can really engage with questions of the intersection of business and public policy, business and society. And we're in the perfect place to do that. A couple of years ago, as I was growing in my career as a China scholar, if I had to make up a list of the few people that I truly admired in the China field, our guest today would have been at or near the top of that list. But then I was just a lowly professor at another business school and didn't have the wherewithal or the confidence to pick up the phone and call this individual. He and I share a lot of ideas about China's economic reforms, and I had admired and followed his work throughout my career and his own. And his story is also a little bit legendary as well in terms of how he actually got to where he was. So when I came to Washington, D.C., and one of the things we have this kind of standard patter of being where we are, real estate is the greatest thing, and we're across the street from the World Bank and the IMF and the IFC, and it's the perfect real estate to really kind of engage in these types of issues. But it happened to have been the case that Justin Lin was recently appointed as the chief economist of the World Bank, and so I thought, well, I'm going to just try out these new wheels of this, what it means to be a dean, and see if I can pick up the phone and get on this man's calendar. And he thankfully took my call and took my meeting, and it was a great conversation. And so when the students came to me and we were thinking about keynote speakers, it just seemed to me to be the perfect thing to end on a discussion of globalization and a discussion of China in the global economy. And not just to think about what it means to think about China's role in the global economy, but to actually push ourselves to think about what we can learn. And so there's nobody better to talk about that than Justin Lin. So I will just turn the mic over to him and say, Justin, thank you for joining us, and if you'll join me in welcoming him to the podium.
Thank Doc for this introduction. In effect, I'd like to thank Doc for inviting me to this conference because this is a homecoming event for me. The last time I was at this university was about 25 years ago, when my wife defended her dissertation. And I came to encourage her, and that was 1987. And although we were the neighbors, and I passed by the street, but I did not come to any event at the GW. So for me, this is a homecoming also. And I also like to thank Doc because since I took the job at the World Bank, one thing I missed the most is the opportunity to talk to colleagues or students in the universities. Because before I took the job, I was a professor at the Peking University for 15 years. And I really enjoy the opportunity to interact with young minds, with colleagues. And I think today, I will have the opportunity again. Certainly, the topic I'd like to talk today is related to something now is very popular about the rethinking of all kinds of theory because of the event in the global economy and what happened in North Africa and Middle East. And as a development economist, certainly that gave me an opportunity to reflect what I learned, what I observed, and what I can propose. So today, I'd like to talk about 3 issues. One is that, how can this kind of global event stimulate people to rethink? And the second is that, well, if we rethink, can we propose something new? And from my point of view, I'd like to propose something I call new structural economics. And the third thing I'd like to discuss with you is that whether this kind of new structural economics can help the government, or also the business communities to better achieve their goals. And so that started with the first one. The reason that we have some kind of rethinking is because what is the role of the theory? I think the role of the theory is try to help us to understand the economic phenomena. And not only to understand the economic phenomena, but also to base on those kind of understanding to help us to design better policies in order to change the world. And whenever the economic theory cannot explain the phenomenon, or the policy based on the theory cannot achieve its intended goal, then people will have rethinking. And this is what we have in the world now, because a lot of the economic theory in finance or in macroeconomics cannot predict what happened or guide us about to cope with the challenge in the world now. And so that promote people to have a lot of rethinkings. And if we use that criterion, we know that in the field of development economics, I like to say, since its formation of development theory as a subdiscipline in modern economics, it has always been in a process of rethinking. We know that development economics is a new subdiscipline. It emerged, it appeared only after the Second World War. And at that time, the development economic theory was dominated by some scholar called structuralists. And at that time, they tried to explain how come the developing country, their income was lower than the developed industrialized country. And their perception, their understanding at that time was the low-income country. They did not have the same industries which are large-scale, capital-intensive, very productive as those high-income countries had. And their understanding at that time was, well, there was a lot of market values for the developing country to build up those kind of large-scale heavy industries and so on. And that was the reason why they were poor. And so at that time, they promoted to have some kind of import substitution strategies in order to help the country build those kind of heavy industry and so on. And, but the country followed those kinds of policy prescriptions. No matter it's in socialist country or in non-socialist country, their economic performance was very poor. And because of that, by the time of 1980s, there was some kind of rethinking and to some kind of paradigm shift. And by the time of 1980s, the perception was that the reason why the developing country to have poor economic performance was not because of they did not have similar industry as in a high-income country. And the perception at that time was that the challenge for the developing country was not market failures. It was the government failures. And the best way to improve the economic performance in the developing country was to have a better market institution. And so they proposed the developing country to have some kind of liberalization and to privatize their economy and so on. And under the so-called Washington Consensus. But now, almost 20 years, more than 20 years have passed. And if you look at the performance of those countries, follow the policy prescription of this kind of neoliberalism or Washington Consensus approach, the result was at the most mixed. And during this period of time, certainly before the 1970s and so on, there was some developing countries, they performed very well, mostly in East Asia, like Japan or the four tigers. And if you look into their policies, they did not follow those kind of a structuralist import substitution strategy. And they did not follow this Washington Consensus approach also. because they propose, they adopt some kind of approach that is export promotion instead of import substitution. That's one thing. Certainly, they rely on market mechanism, but at the same time, they all have very proactive government. And similarly, in the 1980s and so on, most developing countries and socialist economies were on some kind of transition reform process. And most countries did not perform well, but there was a small group of countries, including China, Vietnam, and so on. They did extremely well. And they did not liberalize all their economy. They did not privatize their economy. They adopted a certain kind of dual-track approach. On the one hand, continue to provide some support to their old sectors, large enterprises and so on, state-owned enterprises. But they liberalized the entry of the new firm to new sectors. And they maintain stability and a very dynamic economic growth. Certainly, they move to the market economy, but at the same time, they retain very proactive government intervention in the economy. And since you see that the successful country, they did not follow either school of thought. And they have a combination of market as well as the state. And it's different from the policy prescription of either school. And I think that we need to have some kind of rethinking. As I say, if the theory cannot explain the phenomena, why some countries are successful, some countries fail, or if countries follow policy prescription of the theory and they did not achieve the intended goal, and other countries did not follow those kind of policy prescription, and they had a much better performance, then we certainly need to have a rethinking. And I'd like to say, in effect, the World Bank, certainly its policy, were influenced by the dominant development thinking. But because the World Bank involved heavily in the development process of our client's country, and certainly World Bank needed to review, reflect the effectiveness of its policy all the time. And example was in the 1993, World Bank published a publication called the East Asia Miracles. And that report tried to understand the reason why the East Asian economy has been so successful up to that time. And their conclusion was, well, export promotion as well as market-friendly government. So you need to have export, you need to have market, but you also need to have a government there to help with those kind of policies. And then in the 2004, that the World Bank published another important report called the Lessons of the 1990s. That was after 10 years of transition in Eastern European countries, in reform in many other countries. And the finding at that time was, well, countries have different conditions. So you cannot have one-size-fits-all policies. The policy need to take the country context into consideration. So those kind of Washington consensus try to have one prescription for every country cannot work. And you need to adopt the policy recommendation according to the country situation. And that was the lesson of the 1990s. And then more recently, that the World Bank published another important report by the Growth Commission and headed by Michael Spence and Professor Danny Lepsinger here. Try to understand the certain economies that achieve 7% and higher growth rate continuously for 25 years. And those are the 13 successful star economy in the post-war periods. And to be able to achieve that, certainly, it's a very, very remarkable thing, because if you can continue to grow 7% continuously for 10 years, you will double your economy. And if you were able to do that for 25 years, then you're going to increase your economy size for 6-7 times or more. And the finding from this report was that all the successful countries, first, they are open economy, they have macro stabilities, they have high rate of saving and a high rate of investment. And they all rely on market mechanism. At the same time, they have credible, committed, and capable government to facilitate this whole process. And again, it's a combination of market and also the government. So we can say that, well, World Bank has been leading this kind of rethinking, and then it made a very important contribution to that. And now, based on this, those kind of reports, in effect, they highlight some kind of status effects without providing some kind of consistent theoretical framework to understand them. And my attempt now is to provide a consistent theoretical framework to tie all those kind of status effects together so we can know the causalities. And this attempt I call new structural economics. And the new structural economics is an application of the neoclassic approach to understand economic structure and its evolution. And while the convention of economics, if you use the neoclassic approach to study agriculture, you should call agricultural economics. If you apply the neoclassic approach to understand finance, then you call financial economics. And follow this convention, if I try to apply the neoclassic approach to understand structure and its evolution, I should call it structural economics. But how can I put a new? It was because, as I mentioned, when the profession started to have the development economics, it was dominated by a school of economists called structuralists. And to distinguish myself from them, I call myself new structural economics. In effect, it's also a convention in economics. For example, at the turn of the 20th century, there was a group of economists in the US called the institutionalists. They applied some kind of Marxist approach to study the economy. Okay. And they did not apply the neoclassic approach. And in the 1960s, Douglass North and so on, started to use a neoclassic approach to study institution. And to distinguish this new approach to the older approach, they call new institutional economics. So follow the convention, I call myself new structural economics. And the attempt is to provide some kind of consistent framework to understand the status effects of success and failures. And hopefully, it will provide us some new insight about better policy making. Okay, I'd like to say that for us, working on economic development, certainly the goal is poverty reduction and a continuous development. And a continuous economic growth certainly is the foundation for that. And I'd like to say that sustainable income growth is a recent phenomenon. It was a phenomenon only after the 18th century, because before the 18th century, the average rate of economic growth, even in the Western European country, was about 0.05% per year. That means what? It took about 1,400 years to double per capita income. And also before the 18th century, as you can see, the income gap between now developed part, like the Western European country, and the poor part like Africa, actually was very minimal, 30%, 40% at most. But after the 18th century, the European countries started to take off. And then North America and so on also took off. And you can see the income gap become larger and larger. And that is something people call the Great Divergence. And the reason for the Western European country and North America to be able to accelerate their rate of growth, in the 19th century, it was about 1% per year. And in the 20th century, it was about 2% per year, per capita wise. Was because of, on the one hand, everyone knows the Industrial Revolution that accelerate the rate of technological changes. And on the other hand, which I like to mention, and especially I like to explain, is the structural transformation. Because before any country started to have this kind of takeoff, the majority of the population was in agriculture. And then after the takeoff, they all moved the population away from resources agriculture to the manufacturing sectors and then to the service sectors. And this is the structural changes, and which is crucial for a country to continue its income growth. And I'd just like to give some example. Today, certainly everyone in the US, the main production was computers, was robot, was airplane, and some kind of Wall Street, financial services, and research in a great university, right? But in the 17th century, the economy in the US is something very similar to Africa today, agriculture. And so you have Thanksgiving, right? And then in the 19th century, early 20th century, what were the economic structure in the US, the main production in the US? Well, textile and shoemaking. And that were not different from a low-income country today, right? So you can see that economic progress actually accompanied by this kind of dramatic changes in the production structure. But certainly we need to understand, how come the production structure, economic structure in a country different in different level of their development? My hypothesis is that industrial structure is endogenous to the endowment structure. For economists, what we mean endowment related to the total amount of natural resources, total amount of labor force or capital you have in the economy. And I'd like to argue the industrial structure in an economy is determined, so-called endogenous means it's determined by the endowment structure you have in the economy. And as economists, I like to say, we have not paid enough attention to the importance of endowment and its structure. I think the endowment and its structure are the most fundamental parameters in our development modeling. Because total endowments is the total budget in any economy at any time. How much resources you have, how many workers you have, how many capital you have, determine the total budget you have in the economy at any given time. And secondly, endowments have some kind of structure. You may be more relevant, more abundant in labor force or in resources or in capitals. And those kind of relative abundance determine the relative prices of capital, of labor, of natural resources. For economists, we know two of the most important parameters in our models are always total budget, the relative prices. And the endowment and its structure determine the economy's total budget and the relative prices. So those are the two most important parameters. And when we study the long-term economic dynamics, endowments also have a very nice features. It's given at any given time, but it's changeable over time. And certainly, we like to find out some kind of fundamental parameters, which given at any given time, so we can use that as the starting point for analysis. But it should be also changeable over time, so we have a lever to find a way to change the society, right? And the endowment and its structure has those kind of nice property. Okay, and my argument is that the initial endowment at any time determine the competitive advantage of the economy. If you are abundant in labor force, certainly you will have the competitive advantages in the labor-intensive type of industries or production. And if you are relatively abundant in natural resources, then you will be have competitive advantages in natural resources intensive type of industry or production. And if you are relatively abundant in capitals, you will have competitive advantages in capital intensive industries. Okay. And because of the endowment structure determine the competitive advantages, and we know that competitive advantages is the foundation for competitiveness, so-called competitive advantages proposed by Michael Porter. In effect, you can summarize everything down to following your competitive advantages. And by that, your competitive advantages determine what is the optimal industrial structure in the economy. Okay. And we know that if you want to increase your income, certainly you need to move into a production structure like you have in a high-income country. We know that high-income country, they are all specialized in capital-intensive industries, including physical capital-intensive and human capital-intensive. Because only by that, you can enhance the marginal productivity level, and then you can increase the income. But if you want to move into the more capital-intensive industry, you need to first upgrade your endowment structure. You need to increase the availability of capital for workers. And if you can do that, you change your competitive advantages, you will upgrade your industries. And then I also like to say, in the process of industrial upgrading, it's not only the change in technologies or move into the new sectors. You also need to improve your hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure. And for example, for any economy, before they take off, they're all specialized on resources-based agriculture, something like that. And a farmer in general, a small scale, produced for themselves, and they do not have much economic surplus for, selling to the market. And if they have a little surplus, they sell on the market nearby. Under that kind of situation, certainly you don't need to have, a very elaborate transportation system because people will only sell goods nearby, right? So hard infrastructure like transportation is not that important. And also, in general, they have market exchanges with people who they know on some kind of repeated basis, so they don't have to write a contract. And so you don't have to have an elaborate legal system and legal enforcement system, right? But if you move to a manufacturing production, the scale economy increase. You produce not for yourself, for your own consumption. You produce for the consumption of other people. And you share the goods, not to the nearby market, you share the goods to the national market, international market. And under that situation, certainly you need to have a much better transportation infrastructure. Since you are going to sell the goods to people who you do not know, you need to have a contract, and you need to have a contract enforcement. And also you need to have a much better legal system and so on. Those things I call soft infrastructure. And in the economic development, you upgrade your industries, you also need to improve your hard and soft infrastructure. And I'd like to say, since that all those things are endogenous to your endowment structure, and so if you wanted to have a sustained economic growth, you need to improve your endowment structure first. And how to do that? And I'd like to propose the best way is to follow your competitive advantage you have now. Because if you follow your competitive advantage you have now, you are most competitive. You can produce the most. You can have the largest market share. And so you can increase your wealth in the fastest way. Since you produce more, and you have more to save. At the same time, if you follow your competitive advantage, it's very efficient. So the return to the investment will be the highest. Since you have the most to sell, to save, and you have the highest incentive to save, so your capital endowment will increase the fastest way. And if you increase your capital endowment, you upgrade your endowment structure. and then you upgrade of your production structure and so on. But here is that. The ideas of following your competitive advantages is a principle which can only be understood by someone like me, economist. But most of you are entrepreneur. You do not care about competitive advantage. You only care about profit, right? And so how to translate the ideas of following your competitive advantage in the economy into some kind of spontaneous action by the entrepreneur? The secret is that you need to have a price system which can reflect the relative abundance of the factors you have in your endowment structure. If you are abundant, relatively abundant in labor force, then the wage rate should be relatively low. Capital prices should be relatively high. And vice versa. If you are abundant in capital, then and the relative skills in labor force, then the wage rate should be high and the capital cost should be relatively low. If you have those kind of price system, then the entrepreneur, for the sake of profit maximization, they will automatically go into the industries, adopt the technology which are consistent with your competitive advantages, determined by your endowment structure. And those kind of price systems can only be achieved by competitive market. So that's the reason why we need to have a market system. It's the best institution for a well-functioning, well-performed economy. But if market is so important, why do we need to have a government there? And the reason is that, as I say, the process of economic development is a process of continuous industrial upgrading to new industry, to diversify to new industries. And in this kind of upgrading diversification, well, you have some kind of issue called externalities. Because upgrading is innovation, it's very risky. For the first mover, it can be a successful attempt or a failure. And if it's a failure, the first mover bears all the cost. And it sends a signal to other people, we are not ready. But if it's a success, all other people know it's our new competitive advantage they will follow. Competition comes, and the first mover will not have extra profit compared to others. So you can see that no matter it's a success or it's a failure, the first mover provides useful information for others. But there's a symmetry between the cost of failure and the success, again, the gain of success. So unless you compensate for this kind of externality, otherwise, smart people will always wait until other people try, right? But if everyone waits, you cannot be a dynamic economy. So you need to have someone to compensate for this kind of externalities. And not only so, as I say, the industrial upgrading is not only buying a new machine. It also needs to have improvement in hard infrastructure, soft infrastructure. And the entrepreneur, the private companies, will not be able to internalize all those changes. So you need to have a government there to help with some kind of coordination in this kind of industrial upgrading or diversification. And not only so, in this kind of globalized world, certainly every country, if they want to be competitive, they need to enter into the industry which they have competitive advantages. So more labor intensive or capital intensive. But in these global competitions, if you want to be competitive, your industry need to form some kind of clustering, some kind of conglomeration to further reduce the cost of innovation, information, transportation, and learning, right? And under this kind of situation, if the government does not provide incentive to induce the private sectors to enter into some kind of industry and affirm the clustering very quickly, even they all enter into some industry appear to be consistent with their competitive advantages. They cannot be competitive in the international globalized world. And so it's also very important for the government to provide incentive, some kind of inducement to form the cluster quickly. Otherwise, without those kind of things, the economy may enter into many, many sectors. And without one sector forming large enough clustering. And all this point to, we need to have a facilitation state to be there. Okay. And this is the basic ideas that I have in the new structural economics. And I'd like to say, this idea can provide some kind of framework to understand the status effects from the Gross Commission report, from the lessons of the 1990s, and also from the East Asian miracles. We know that according to the policy recommendation on new structural economics, that you need to follow your competitive advantages. And the condition is that you need to have a well-functioning market, and you need to have a facilitation state. And that was the status effects, number 4 and number 5 of the Gross Commission report. So those are preconditions for a country to have a good performance. And if you follow your competitive advantages, certainly will be an open economy. That's condition number 1, right? And if you follow your competitive advantages, it will be most competitive. So you will have less homegrown crisis. And at the same time, if you have an external shock, the country will have a much better position to engage in some kind of counter-cyclical intervention. So this certainly means that the country will be having a much better stabilities in its macroeconomy. That's condition number 2. And then condition number 3, if you follow your competitive advantages, I argue, you will be most competitive, you will produce the most, you will have the most to save. And your investment will have the highest possible return. Under that kind of situation, certainly you are going to have high saving and a high rate of investment. So that's condition number 3 of the Gross Commission report. I think that Michael Spencer often like to say, if you want to be a successful country, there's ingredients of success, but there's no recipes. And the reason why he said no recipes because he did not have a framework. Sorry, Danny. And I think that there's a recipe. The recipe is following your competitive advantages. And the precondition for following your competitive advantages is market economy and a facilitation state. And then you are going to achieve those kind of 3 ingredients. Okay. And certainly then this is consistent with the East Asian miracles finding. Out-oriented and market-friendly government. Now I come to the hardest part. No one-size-fits-all. Can the new structural economics provide some insight about what size fits what? Because now I'm working at the World Bank, like Danny, a year ago, we visited the country. The government always asks us for advice. If I'm giving the advice to the government, say, well, no one size fits all, did I bring any useful information to them? No, I should tell them what size fits what, right? To understand all what conditions we have now, so what policy will be applicable. And I'd like to give an example. The new structural economics means country in different level of development, their production structure will be different, right? Their industry will be different. In the early stage of development, most of industries will be in resources intensive, whatever intensive type of operation. In general, firms are small scales. They use mature technologies. They produce mature product. And when you progress to higher income stages, you go into more capital intensive. And they use more new technologies. And you have a much larger capital size. At the same time, technology will be newer, so more uncertain, more risk. That's our understanding from the production side. Now, coming to what is implication in the financial structure? Well, if In the early stages, most of the production, no matter it's in agriculture or in manufacturing sectors or in service sectors, it will be dominated by small-scale firms or farms. The capital requirement will be very small. And they use mature technology. So under that kind of situation, the major source of risk for the financial services will be whether the operators, the entrepreneur, are good entrepreneur or not. That would be the major source of risk. What kinds of financial institution can provide those kind of small-scale capital or financial services and better cope with the main source of risk is the entrepreneurship of the operators. Certainly should be small, local financial institutions. Some may be informal financial sectors or small local banks. And when you reach a higher stage of development, now your production scale become larger, capital requirement become larger. Your technology move to the global technology frontier. You have more risk from those kind of new technology and so on. What kind of financial institution can serve that better? Certainly, either large bank, so they can spread the risk, or equity market. They can mobilize large capital input and sometimes spread the risk. And I think this is the reason why in high-income country, in the early stage of development, like in the US, in early stage of development, rely mainly on small and local banks. And only gradually your economy develop. And large-scale capital-intensive technological advanced firm become more important in the economy, then it started to have the large bank and equity market becomes more important. However, if we read, well, sorry, you may have some professor in financial economics here. If I say something wrong, you can criticize me later. In general, today, we propose to develop big banks and equity market in developing countries. And we always think, well, those kind of small and local banks are backward. And, in a way, try to downplay the importance of that. And those kind of policy recommendation is some kind of one-size-fits-all. Did not take into the different level of economic development, require different kind of institution, different kind of financial services. This is one example. Okay, and more important for us today is that I like to talk about one of the most contentious topic, industrial policies. When I came to the World Bank 2.5 years ago, I started to talk about industrial policies. And at the beginning, many people think I'm some kind of animal from, other planet. It's something so stupid. Everyone knows it won't work. The pick winners always end up with some kind of picking losers. And so they think, how come I try to talk about the issue of industrial policy? But today I'd like to say, this kind of new structural economics will provide us some kind of new insight to the government's role in facilitating the industrial development. Because as I mentioned, from the new structural economics, you need to have a market system. But in the industrial upgrading and diversification, you also need to have the government play the facilitation role. And I'd like to say, yes, most industrial policy failed. But if you look historically, all the successful countries also benefited from their industrial policies. And so it's very important for us to understand what determines the success and the failures. Okay. Well, the law of industrial policy is, it's easy to understand because you need to have a coordination, you need to have compensated for externalities, and you need to encourage the forming of collaboration. And the government can play that role. And in the past, most industrial policy failed. The attempt to pick winners, end up as picking winners. From the new structural economics, it's easy to understand. Because in the past, most industrial policies, under the guidance of structuralism, try to develop or try to enter the industry which go against their competitive advantages. Just like I mentioned, at that time, in the post-war periods, in general, the policy recommended by the economic profession, and including the multilateral development agency like the World Bank, try to encourage low-income agrarian economies to go into the development of large-scale capital-intensive industries. And that go against their competitive advantages. Since it went against their competitive advantages, firms in those kind of sectors were not viable in an open competitive market. And because of that, the government need to give those firms all kind of protection and subsidies, and a huge protection and subsidies, to encourage firms to make investment in those areas. After the investment, also need to give subsidies and protection in order to help them to continue to operate. And those kind of subsidy and protection became economic rent. And so you have all kind of rent-seeking, corruption, capture, and certainly also inefficient in the resource allocation. That was the reason why the industrial policy in the past failed. And here that my argument that industrial policy will be successful only when the government try to facilitate the industrial upgrading or diversification into the sectors which the economies has latent competitive advantages. So-called latent competitive advantage is that in the process of accumulation of your capitals, certainly you need to upgrade into the new industry, right? You have competitive advantage determined by your endowment structure. And in the past, you were more labor intensive. Now you accumulate capital. You need to move into more capital intensive. If you look into the endowment structure, you should have competitive advantage in those kind of new industries. But because of lack of coordination, facilitation, then the private firm has not reached there or has not really turned their competitive advantage into competitiveness. And the government needs to help with those kind of facilitation. If the government plays those kind of role, then industrial policy will be successful. Because once you help with compensation for externality or coordination, then the firm should become competitive quickly. But the issue is that how to identify those kind of sectors you have latent competitive advantages. If you want to facilitate, you need to know what to facilitate. Just like we often say, you need to aim, ready, fire, right? And you need to aim the right industry first. And here's that, how to aim the right industries. And what can we learn from the history? Well, I think that historically is very interesting. All the successful countries, they benefit from industrial policy. But in the process of government facilitation, in general, they try to model countries which their per capita income was not too far away from them. And I can start it from the England in the 16th, 17th century. At that time, Netherlands, their income, their industrialization were higher than the United Kingdom. And the English government, king, they adopt all kind of policy to encourage industrialization in England. And it was successful. But at that time, the per capita income in England was already about 70% of the per capita income of Netherlands. So the gap was not large. And after the Industrial Revolution, in the late 19th century, Germany, France, United States also had some kind of industrial policy to support their industrialization, to catch up the Britain. At that time, their per capita income was about 60% to 75% of United Kingdom's per capita income. And at the same period of time, Russia, Poland, Hungary, and so on, all adopted similar policy with similar target to catch up United Kingdom. But they did not succeed. But if you look into the reason of why they did not succeed, you can also point to many other reasons. But one striking fact was that their per capita income was only about 20%, or at the most 30% of UK's per capita income at that time. But we know that institutions and so on reflect the level of the development, right? And low income means low level of development and low endowment structure. Then, at a similar time, Meiji Restoration in Japan was successful. And one difference compared to Japan and Russia, Poland was that Japan, they modeled after Prussia, Germany, instead of United Kingdom directly. And if you look into their income gap, Japan at that time, per capita income was about 40% of Prussia's per capita income already. If Japan wanted to model after United Kingdom directly, its per capita income would be only about 20% of UK's per capita income, like Russia. Okay. And then in the 1960s, Japan also tried to have an industrial policy to catch up the US. Japan was successful, and its per capita income was about 40%, 50% of US per capita income already. Then the 1960s to the 1980s, the first small dragon like Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, except for Hong Kong, all have industrial policies, and they were successful. And compared to other post-war countries, the difference was that these East Asian tigers, they modeled after Japan, and their per capita income was about 30, 40% of Japan's per capita income. And the most recent example was Ireland. In the 1980s, they also have industrial policy to encourage the development of pharmaceutical, chemical, and so on. And they were successful. And they modeled, they tried to catch up US. And their per capita income in the 1980s was already about 40% of US per capita income. Okay, so from this, I can find that the successful country, in general, they model after countries which are not too far away from them. Unsuccessful countries, in general, they try to be too ambitious, try to model after countries which are too far away. Like China in the 1950s, and had an industrial policy. The attempt was to catch up Britain in 10 years, to catch up US in 15 years, and try to develop similar industry that as those industries in the US, in Britain. But the East Asian economy, they did not follow that. They tried to develop industry that was in Japan, and which the gap in terms of technology and so on was much smaller. So by this, I developed a new approach called growth identification and facilitation. The first step is that for any developing country, if they want to accelerate growth, certainly they need to upgrade their industry and diversify their industry. And what kind of industry they should go? I propose to look into countries which has similar endowment structure as yours. Because countries with similar endowment structure means their competitive advantage should be similar. And they are growing dynamically. Their per capita income are about twice as high or 3 times as high as yours. And they are growing dynamically. And I look into the sector they are growing dynamically in the past 20, 30 years. My argument is that if a country growing dynamically for 20 or 30 years, this economy should basically follow their competitive advantages. If they do not follow their competitive advantages, they cannot have a dynamic growth for 20 or 30 years. Especially the tradable sectors, which are growing dynamically for 20 or 30 years. That sectors must be consistent with their competitive advantages, because no government can subsidize the tradable sectors continuously for 20 or 30 years. And that sector continued to grow very dynamically. Okay. And those kind of sectors are likely to be your latent competitive advantages. My argument is that, well, if they are growing dynamically for 20 or 30 years, the wage rate in those countries will be double, triple, quadruples. And so 20, 30 years ago, they have had a competitive advantage in those kind of sectors. Now, with the wage rate increase, they are going to lose competitive advantage in those kind of sectors. If they are losing competitive in those kind of sectors, then we give you an opportunity to enter, use your low wages as a competitiveness, and to turn that into a dynamic sector in your economy. I think this is important not only for the government, it's also important for the business community. I grew up in Taiwan. When I was young, and I talked to my uncle and so on, and they were successful businessmen. And I had an MBA program. So when I started my MBA, and I talked to my uncles and their friends and so on, I asked, how do you choose the new sector to enter? They told me, very simple. Went to Japan to see what they produced 15 years ago. And then come home to make investment in those kind of sectors. 90% of opportunity, you will be successful. And this is a principle that I summarized from their experiences. And now I theorize that, okay. And secondly, after you identify those list of sectors, which are likely to be your latent competitive advantages, the government can come home to see whether the private sectors has already identified them, already enters. And if you already have some private discovery, they entered, then you try to analyze what are the binding constraints. How come they cannot use low wages to compete with them? And what are the binding constraints? It can be access to credit, or foreign exchanges, or skilled workers, or infrastructure. Then the government should play those kind of facilitation role to coordinate the investment in those areas or improvement in those kind of institutions. The second step. The third step is that some of the list in your potential latent competitive advantage sectors may be totally new to you. But under this kind of situation, the government can encourage firms in those countries to relocate their production to your country. And I think the firm in those countries will have incentive to do that because their wage rate increases so rapidly. They are losing competitive advantage in those kind of sectors. Certainly, they will have the incentive to relocate their production to tap into the low wage potential in other countries in order to continue their profitabilities and utilize their market linkage and so on, right? And then the government should ask, how come those firms has not come yet? What are the binding constraints? Maybe it's information issue. Maybe because your infrastructure is not as good, or your skilled workers are not as abundant and so on. Then the government can help to improve those kind of areas. And the fourth one is that, well, we know technology is changing so fast. So there was always some kind of new sectors, new industry, new product emerged. Those kind of product and so on did not exist 20 or 30 years ago. So your pointer country may not have those kind of industry at all. And you have some private firm domestically, they may identify those kind of opportunities. And the government also need to pay attention to the domestic private discovery. And when you see the potential, then you also need to help them to remove the binding constraint. And one example is India's information industries. We know that India, in the 1980s, some private sectors, they identify those kind of information services. And at the beginning, they rely on satellite telecommunication. And it was very expensive. But they already showed potential. So after identifying that, the Indian government helped to improve the telecommunication by those kind of land-based, cable-based, sea-based, sea cable-based, and dramatically reduced the cost of telecommunication. And that was one of the reasons why the India information sector now become such a dynamic part of their economy. And the fifth one is that in developing countries in general, their hard infrastructure is poor. Their soft infrastructure is poor also. Certainly, it's desirable to improve the whole nation's infrastructure, but it takes resources, takes time, right? And under this kind of situation, the government can provide some kind of partial solution. That is to set up the industrial parks or export processing zone, industrial zone. Within that zone or park, the infrastructure, both hard and soft, will be good enough to reduce the transaction cost of the firm and to encourage domestic private investment or foreign direct investment to produce those kind of goods as I mentioned, identified in the step one. And lastly, the government need to compensate for the first movers. And in developing countries, there are several ways that government use to compensate for the first mover. Either give some kind of tax incentive for a limited periods. And in developing countries, access to credit in general is very poor for the new small and medium-sized firm. And the government can also arrange some kind of access to credit. It's an incentive, according to the list of the industry that the government likes to promote. Or access to foreign exchanges, because in developing countries in general, they have some limitation of access to foreign exchanges. But if you want to upgrade into the new industry, you need to import equipment, machinery, and so on. And to help them to overcome those kind of liquidities can also be used as an incentive. But I'd like to say, although I mentioned some kind of incentive is desirable, but it will be different from the incentive as used in the old industrial policy. The difference is that the old industrial policy, those kind of incentive or protection or subsidies were used to compensate for the issue of viability. Those firms are not viable. And those kind of protection is to overcome those kind of viability issue. And the incentive I propose here is used to compensate for externalities. The sectors should be consistent with your competitive advantages. But you need to overcome the externality created by the first mover. But the amount compensated for the externality will be much smaller than the amount required for compensated for viabilities. So, in a Marxist term, the quantitative difference will make the qualitative difference. Okay, so this is the last step. So I appreciate you have the opportunity to exchange the idea I have, and I like to have comments or criticism or disagreement from you. Thank you. So Danny, do you have any questions? Welcome.
So thank you for the very interesting talk. But
yeah.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what a country does that's already a developed country but basically lacks any industrial policy at all. And I think actually is, speaking specifically about the United States, I think we're actually hurting tremendously because of it, because we don't actually have a facilitating body. And we did used to as you point out, historically hundreds of years ago, but even in the 50s, the government was much more active in thinking about industrial policy. How do I personally think completely agree that we are in need of that, but
Yeah.
how does a developed country think about the facilitation issues and roles?
I think that in a high-income country, actually, you always have industrial policy. And, but the way that a high-income country implement the industrial policy would be somewhat different from the developing country. The reason is that the high-income country, they are on the global technological frontier. Under this kind of situation, what will be the next industries will be harder to understand, to predict, than the developing country. Developing country can model after the high-income country in some kind of flying geese pattern, but high-income country is very hard. By saying so, does not mean high-income country does not have picking winners. In general, high-income country, the industrial policy are carried out in 4 ways. The first one is patent. Certainly, patent is export incentive. It's sector neutral, right? But other 3, the support for basic research. You have NSF. But resources of NSF is limited, right? So the NSF set some kind of priority on what kind of science, what kind of technology that NSF wanted to support. It's already a picking winner, right? And secondly is some kind of procurement policies, like defense procurement or government procurement. Another kind of procurement that can help the new technology, new sectors to reach the economy scale of production quickly. And it's also a picking winners. And the third one, and the last one is mandate. Just like now you have biofuel mandate. By the time of which year, how many percentage of the gasoline should use biofuel. And that is also picking winners. So I think that the high-income country, its format of industrial policy will be less observable as in the developing country, that's for sure. But I like to say, even now, every day, the high-income country is practicing industrial policy all the time. The issue is that whether you give enough resources or not. And I think it's not, you do not. Maybe the support for NSF or the support for leading universities like George Washington University is not enough. And if they can increase more of this kind of support, certainly you are going to have more new technology innovation and more marketable new industry and technologies, and you can have a faster rate of economic growth. Okay? I see some hands raised.
Dr. Lin, welcome to our university. My name is David Lee, and I'm actually an alumnus from the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. So it's a delightment to see you on the other side of the world.
Good to see you here.
My question is, do you think the political system or the political doctrine of a government plays a role in the ability to facilitate this industrial development in your theory framework?
Good questions. From my observation, the political system is not such a crucial determination of a country's ability to pursue industrial policies. Certainly, if you look into the East Asian economies, they tend to have authoritarian regime, and they have industrial policy, they are successful. But I mentioned the Ireland's examples. Ireland is a democratic society. And I'd like to mention, Ireland started to have industrial policy to encourage new industries starting from 1960s. They were not successful. Until 1987, they changed from without picking winner to picking winners. Before 87, they have industrial development authorities. And they know that you need to compensate for the first movers. And at that time, the idea is that export promotion is good. And so their incentive is, for any firm engaged in new investment, which, target for export, can receive incentive, credit or grant. They were not very successful. Until 1987, they changed it to selectivity. They focused on, at the beginning, 4 sectors: chemical industry, pharmaceutical, and also electronics and information sectors. Later on, they add 1 sector, financial services. And they started to take off. Before 1987, we know that Ireland was a poor country in Europe, so they had a large out-migration of labor force. And Irish people were, the nickname for Irish people or Irish migration worker was beggars of Europe. After the 1987, when they started to have a selectivity, and they target US, their industrial development authorities proactively invite the multilateral companies in the US to make investment in Ireland. And they were successful. And I think they were successful. Certainly, Ireland had good education, speak English, and they are member of the EU. But at the same time, the reason why those kind of multilateral wanted to move their, operation to Ireland was because the wage rate in Ireland was less than half of the wage rate in the US. That was a very important principle that I have. And they become successful. But as you know, Ireland is a democratic society. And so I think that more important is that you need to have a vision, you have a right target, you need to have an institution which are proactively try to encourage investment domestic, the private sectors, and also foreign direct investment. And at the same time, here, I like to be very controversial. You need to be selective. As I mentioned, before 1987, Ireland, it was just some kind of patent system, something like that. Although it's ex-ante, but it did not have a sector focus. Without sector focus, you cannot have large enough conglomeration. Without large enough conglomeration, you cannot be competitive. Even the sectors is consistent with your competitive advantages. So I think to follow this kind of ideas of following your competitive advantages, to enter into the sectors and to tap the potential or latent competitive advantages, and to give incentive in order to firm the conglomeration quickly. I think that's more important than the political system.
So time for maybe one more question, and then we have to let Dr. Lin go.
Maybe we should have a gender balance, right?
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you. I'm from University of Maryland, and I'm very, very happy to see you. It seems to me that you really emphasize the necessity to compensate the first mover, but I think if such a package of compensation exists, that really to the first mover choosing to be the first mover is like flipping a coin. That is, head I win, but tail I don't lose. So we can actually imagine that a lot of people would just want to be the first mover, but technically we just have one first mover. So under such a circumstance, how does the government solve such problem?
Well, I think the first mover, I think it's not only one first mover. You can have a group of people to enter at the same time, but if they enter into the new industries, then they all receive those kind of preferential treatment. For example, if I want to develop a new sectors, and it's new to us, and so I say, well, if you make investment in those kind of sectors, you receive tax incentive for 5 years. And after 5 years, this sector has become so dynamic. You don't have to have those kind of tax incentive anymore. So first mover, my concept is not only one person. It's a period of time. Depends on whether the sector is new or not. If the sector is new, if the sector you want to encourage, then you provide those kind of incentive. Okay?
So please join me again in thanking Dr. Lin.
Well, my pleasure. Okay. So is that a
This
is
is
that
a
a
little
blind
gift
or-
for a token of our appreciation.
Thank
and
you
in
very much.
addition, the students have donated a gift on your behalf to the Red Cross for earthquake relief in
Wow,
Japan.
that's wonderful.
So thank you so much
Thank you
again.
very much.
It's just been such a treat to have you here.
And my wife will be so happy to have this gift.
Thank you, Dr. Lin.
Thank you.
First of many visits.
Thank you.